So good afternoon. I'm Merav Cohen. I'm a recent PhD graduate. I'm advised by Daniel Ornstein at the Technion, and I'm based here in Haifa, Israel, where I've been researching what makes a social ecological system more resilient. And over the past few years, I've been involved with the social ecological research theme at eLTER, and I was really fortunate to enjoy its excellent research community, some of the annual gatherings and opportunities for learning and personal development. So for all of this, including this opportunity, I'm very grateful. I was unable to attend Finland, so I'm very happy for this opportunity to share back some of my work. And I hope it may inspire you to explore resilience and how to approach it in your own research, and potentially even think of resilience theory in relation to the development of the standard observations at eLTER. So I want you to I invite you to keep that in mind throughout my presentation. And if you're interested, we can have a conversation later offline. Okay, let's dive into it. So before we go into the research, it's important to make sure that we all talk about the same thing when we say resilience. It's been used in various ways across and even within disciplines. So our working definition is that a system is resilient if it has the capacity to cope with disturbances without losing most of its identity, meaning its defining structure and function and feedbacks its functionality. And it's important to stress that it's not about resisting the change. Rather, it's about the capacity to absorb it, this disturbance, and to adapt or transform as needed to prevent a breakdown. This definition of resilience doesn't delve into the root causes or the conditions that enable this disturbance, this hazard or exposure to it, or the susceptibility of the system to be affected by it. So it's only about the capacity to cope. So if you're looking at this tree, for example, it was toppled by some disturbance. It's resilient if it maintains its identity, however we define it. And here we can get a little philosophical, photosynthesizing, providing habitat, life. As you can see here, it continues to bloom despite being toppled over. And resilience has long been studied regarding specific parts of the system. This is referred to resilience of what to what. But since the early 2000s, there's a growing body of research that aims to generalize our understanding of resilience so that humanity can be better prepared for the unknown. And our focus is on general resilience, which emerged to relate to any system, the system as a whole, or any part of it, and any kind of disturbance, including such that are new and unforeseen. And this builds on the many specified case studies that identify different sets of qualities or attributes, or characteristics, principles. Here and on, I'll refer to them all together as attributes, and associate these with greater systemic resilience. And we address two main gaps in the research. One is that traditionally, studying social ecological resilience was focused mainly on the ecological part of the system. So let's say we have a biophysical system like a lake or a forest, and we want to see how to preserve it. While human society was hardly ever in the focus of resilience research here. And this is, we want here to encompass it as a component within this single holistic system. And second is that despite the identification of these different resilience attributes, there's been a challenge to test and validate them. So we identified COVID-19 as an opportunity to do so, to observe and compare how different systems that vary in their structures and mechanisms and external conditions all cope with the same shock simultaneously. Hold on, I'm having a hard time here moving this. Okay. So looking at the intersection between the social and the biophysical world, how could it have shaped differently our experience of the crisis and the resilience of our societies? So our big question is, what social ecological attributes can strengthen or weaken a society's resilience in the face of a major unknown and unpredictable crisis? And we used the case study of the pandemic and asked, well, what attributes actually played a role in societal coping with COVID-19? But to answer this, we first have to ask, well, what are the attributes that are most recognized to be associated with general resilience in the literature on the one hand, and second, well, what are the variables that we should look at to assess COVID impacts on the other? And results from these two parts fed into our case study in part 3 that I'm going to introduce a little later in this presentation. And together they respond or begin to respond this main research question. And while each of these chapters has really interesting local insights, for the purpose of this presentation, I will exclude part 2 with your permission and focus on the study's overall contribution to our understanding of general resilience. But if you're curious about COVID impacts and how we've identified them during the height of the pandemic, it was recently published in Social Science and Medicine in open access, and I welcome you all to take a look. So again, here I'm going to focus on the overall contribution of this study to our understanding of general resilience, simply because I feel like this would be more interesting and relevant potentially to viewers of this webinar. So as I mentioned in the intro, the general resilience body of research portrays a set of attributes that can be associated with greater resilience, meaning that they're widely used as a proxy by which we assess and measure it. But the theory of general resilience is not well developed yet. So studies identify these attributes in varying degrees of overlap, lacking terminological consistency. So to clarify these issues, we conducted a literature review and synthesis where we collected data both from academic databases and from major research institutions and international NGOs, and identified 12 key sources, which we then analyzed and synthesized to reorganize information to explore it more deeply and really gain insight about this body of research as a whole. So here you can see how we organize these attributes into 3 overarching themes. Now, don't be alarmed. I'll walk you through it. The darker shade of gray indicates that more publications noted these attributes, and we highlighted in red the ones that were most supported by 5 of these key publications and above. And we found broad consensus to some of these attributes and strong support for these ones, but let's take a closer look at them and see what they actually mean. So these are the attributes that relate to the structure of the system, either to its components or to the links between them. Now, diversity and redundancy can relate to all forms, either by physical, social, or economic. So it can relate to species or landscapes or cultures and stakeholders or interest and even perspectives. When we say modularity, what we mean is a state in which components are linked well internally, but are loosely connected to one another. It's about finding that sweet spot where a disturbance in one part of the system doesn't immediately spread and crash the rest of the system, so it can be contained. And this can also refer both to physical things like pathogens, right, during COVID, or to invasive species or fires when we think of fire breaks, right? But it can also relate to non-physical things like ideas. Think about COVID and how news quickly spread through various channels of media. 200 years ago, some of the fake news we saw during COVID may have not been so easily spread out. Here are the attributes that we categorize related to competency and action. So these show broad consensus regarding learning and innovation, and these include various things. It's promoting experimentation and learning and knowledge and skill and innovation. But this attribute is also very closely linked to other attributes like investing in monitoring or embracing change rather than maintaining processes that don't work. Managing feedbacks mean that a change in one part of the system is rapidly noticed and responded by other parts of the system, meaning that it quickly, or I'll give you an example. So quickly identifying that the pandemic broke out and immediately closing the borders. So here a feedback is tight, so things don't go unnoticed and escalate. The third and last category we identified is that of stores and assets. It means things that the system has or doesn't have. Here we see strong support for leadership, which interestingly was acknowledged for its contribution to both building trust, supporting social networks, forging common visions and goals, just to name a few. So you can already sense here what I'm trying to convey, the complexity of this comparison and how things are not very clear cut when we try to do so. So indeed, when we're zooming out, we can clearly say that comparing these attributes across sources proved far more challenging than we have anticipated. I mentioned the couple of examples about learning and leadership, but you can also look at having reserves, for example, essentially having reserves of something, excess stock, both physical and non-physical, also is something like redundancy, right? So acknowledging this complexity of terminology really shifted the focus of the study. Rather than looking at how many publications relate to each of these attributes, we shifted to look at the relationships between them. So all sources note that there are strong connections between many of these attributes, and we find that combined, these connections suggest a nested structure. We developed this example of the attribute of learning to portray how the elements composing it interact with one another. So all of these learning elements are further connected to other attributes not listed here. This is just for simplification. So this conceptual model indicates a process that, although it's iterative, it has clear directionality leading from monitoring here at the top and experimentation all the way through to innovation and ultimately to improve our awareness to the crisis and respond to it. Building on these findings and the ones I mentioned about the COVID impact, we tested these resilience attributes in the context of COVID through a case study in Taiwan. This is a pilot of a series of case studies to be compared in the future, and it was conducted remotely in tight collaboration with a wonderful local research team that operates the Changhua LTSER platform, the long-term socio-ecological research platform. And I'm not going to dive deep into the methods because if I do so, I won't have time to do real interesting stuff. But just to give you an overview, this included interviews with the diverse stakeholders. We produced cognitive maps, aggregated them, and then we did a network analysis. We collected some background data, both about the COVID impacts and characteristics of the place. And all of this fed into a structured group discussion, which we then analyzed thematically to validate and clarify all the information we gathered. Finally, all these findings were systematically synthesized to answer this part 3 questions, really what attributes actually played a role in this platform and this society living in this area and how they coped with COVID-19. Just to humor you, this is what the fuzzy map looks like. If you're curious, on my personal website, there's another presentation I did just about this methodology of using this participatory fuzzy map, and so I can link that also in the notes for this webinar. So you can see what we did here is we portrayed the level of agreement by the participants in this aggregated map in color coding, and we excluded the lowest level of agreement just to keep it more simple. And if you're curious about the color of the lines, and that's just whether it's a positive or a negative connection. And then we showed it within our group discussion. We showed it to participants because the interaction with and among the stakeholders was just as important to us as the information that they provided. So here we meant to really walk the talk of transformative social ecological research, designing a study that is not just extractive of information, but is actually mutually beneficial, where we shared back data and findings, we built capacity to think in systems, and also some relationships as we provided this opportunity for participants to discuss common problems and possible solution. Now, just to give you an idea about what the analysis looked like, if you're curious. So our network analysis produced these main impacts or drivers, central nodes, receivers, and additional narratives that are highlighted. And the local experience as a whole produced key narratives. And these key narratives indicated some of these attributes. As you can see here, let's look at one example. I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but just look at the first example here. So one of the main impacts that we identified by participants was that there was a strong impact on the tourism, because tourism is a fundamental pillar of this local community. And this really exemplified just how important economic diversity can be, right? And then main driving factors, if we're looking here at the drivers, point to the importance of finding that optimal connectivity. So to be connected, but not too connected. So the characteristics of the local population, where they have low population density on the one hand, and on the other, they have very close social ties. And it also surfaced looking at the role of the media as a connector during a time where people were not able to meet in person. So spreading the information far and wide. So going back to our question, we find that a couple of the attributes emerged as prominent. Modularity, or managing this level of connectivity, that's not surprising, right? We're talking about COVID. It makes sense that it will come up very prominently. The second one is flexibility, and that's one we haven't mentioned yet. It means having options available, but also the capacity and willingness to engage with them. Now, this is a relatively recent addition to the resilience literature, and that's why it didn't come up very strongly in our literature review. But it has an overarching role, and this is why it came up so strongly in this case study. And you will see this in the conceptual model I'll show you in a moment. The study also strengthened or highlighted the need to explore attributes that relate to human society. What do we mean by that? It means looking at it's often referred to as socio-cognitive constructs, meaning how was our experience during crisis and our coping with it, how was it shaped by our past experiences, by our norms, by values, by beliefs and biases, these kinds of things. And this is also relatively a recent development in the theory of resilience research. Okay, deep breath. So overall, this study shows that despite the desire to generalize resilience attributes, they are highly context dependent. So they depend on our various external conditions, like the ones listed here. But also, and this is where I want to kind of stop and focus, the interrelationships among the attributes themselves. So different attributes, whether you have them or you don't, compensate other attributes, whether you have them or you don't, okay? They can compensate for each other, they can hinder each other, they cut across scales, and they also sometimes encompass one another conceptually in this type of nested structure. So importantly, the classification of these attributes, as I'm going to show you in a moment, developing their essential typology, how they conceptually relate to one another, and the structure is a significant contribution of this study to the theory. So this is the conceptual model. It shows that tiered structure. And you can find the 1, 2, 3 categories that I mentioned before. So it's not too foreign. Oops. You can see these categories. But I want to start us off at the end. Let's look at the bottom. Let's look here at resilience. So self-organizing is closest to enabling higher levels of resilience, meaning for the system to have this attribute that it self-organizes well. And it is directly enabled here by flexibility that I just mentioned, having that combination of both having alternatives available and the willingness and capacity to engage with them, which, according to our synthesis, is achieved in these 3 ways. So having certain systemic structures, so cultivating certain kinds of capital assets, and exercising certain practices. Within this overarching simplified model, each of these three main pathways include a web of relationships, and not all of them we understand yet, but I think we made a big first step towards understanding them. So these relationships are within each of these categories and across, and we portray some of them here in this graphic. So for example, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it'll take us too long, but here, let's look at number 2 here, for example. Let's look at cultivating capital assets. So here we can see that attributes related to the subjective experience right here, and we can find that reserves are essentially a type of assets, right? All of these titles are attributes used in the literature, okay? So here we're trying to just make order, right? To organize everything and so that we can better understand it. And we can see social capital. This is comprised of elements that are tightly connected and combined directly influence people's sense of agency. Here at the bottom, under exercising particular practices, this includes the more detailed mapping that we did before. I showed you before about learning and innovation, but we also see complex adaptive systems thinking, CAS thinking. I'm going to go back to this in a moment. But having that systems thinking approach, we see that it includes embracing change and uncertainty, because it really does conceptually. This is how it's explained. So this is one of its fundamental building blocks, and this is what we're trying to confer in this graphic. So all of this to suggest, and this is our conclusion here, is that some hierarchy among these attributes could be inferred from our study. So here I want to relate specifically to complex adaptive systems thinking, those two yellow ones that are highlighted, and to monitoring. CAS thinking refers to, and I quote, adopting a systems framework, tolerating and embracing uncertainty, investigating critical thresholds and nonlinearities, and acknowledging epistemological pluralism. This is by Biggs et al., 2015, and I really feel like it really encompasses what complex adaptive systems thinking means. And the reason why complex adaptive systems is highlighted here and why we find it to be fundamental, so is monitoring, is because both of these elements don't only serve a role in themselves, but they're crucial for managing and balancing all other attributes. So monitoring as well, it informs complex adaptive systems thinking on central system processes, and that's crucial due to this real multitude of factors that are affecting systemic resilience. So lastly, based on all of this, we propose 3 interconnected principles for future resilience practice and research. One is that we have to implement all of these attributes. If we exclude some, if we focus on just a mere few, it will create fragilities, okay? Second is that as we consider all of these attributes, to employ this holistic systems thinking approach within context. And third, in applying this system thinking approach, to integrate this understanding, these established attribute connections as we have mapped them out so far. So overall, this study provides a strong grasp of the prevailing attributes and their definitions, and also some key lessons regarding the importance and the need to focus on their interrelationships, both, again, in resilience practice and in future research. So the insight, these are our insights from basically this 3-part of the study. And when we're looking into the future, a broader challenge now would be to complete this in a multiple context for a comparative study. So to accumulate evidence regarding these attributes and how they manifested in different social ecological systems, so that we can see how different external conditions and characteristics and mechanisms, how they play out for the same disturbance that actually happened at the same time. Because what we learn from this could really inform protocols for long-term social ecological research, especially now as the standard observation are being formulated for the eLTER-RI. So with that, I would like to express my gratitude to all the wonderful organizations and individuals that supported this work. And I thank you so much for your listening. I welcome your questions, your comments, and of course, any future engagement. Welcome to reach out through these channels. Thanks so much.